ask you to start off with, get your bulletin out, and if you've got a pencil, you may want to jot down some notes. And if nothing else, you can write me a nasty letter saying, change what you're preaching on, okay? How many of you got your paper this week and you got 4 pages of this? The real fine print of all the amendments and the propositions that's on the ballot. How many of you, show of hands, how many of you read it all? That's what I thought, because I'm one that this year I did. And the only reason I did was because after I started talking about amendment number 3, I've had several people over the course of the last few weeks that says, you know, I always get in the ballot booth and I see these propositions and I don't know whether I'm supposed to vote for them or vote against them, because I don't understand what they're really for. And I don't propose today to tell you how you should vote. And I'm sure not going to tell you who to vote for. But I'd like for you to have a little enlightenment on what each one of these propositions are, so that whenever you go into the ballot booth, and I pray that everyone who is of legal age is already registered so that they does go to vote. I think it's important for our democracy. And so what I'm going to start off with was the first one is amendment number 2. And it is about sports betting. If that is a yes vote, if that passes, then it'll be legal to vote on the professional teams in the state of Missouri, online or through the riverboats or whatever. One of the things that they are pushing for, those that are for this amendment, are saying it's going to give all this money to the schools. I read the entire paper, and a lot of it was about that. The first priority of that amendment of the revenue is going to go to first reimburse all their expenses. The second priority is going to be going to establish or fund a compulsive gambling prevention fund. The first $5 million of revenue is going to go to that before it goes anyplace else. If there's anything left over, then it will go into schools. Now, those of us who remember whenever they voted on the lottery and they voted on the riverboat gambling, and remember they were saying, you know, all this money is going to go to the schools, and they just painted the picture that schools were just going to be spending money like crazy because they didn't know what to do with all of it. And you remember what happened was the money that came from there went to the schools, and the money that had been going to the schools went someplace else. I don't think anybody's overwhelmed in any of the schools because of the lottery or because of the riverboat gambling, and I don't think it's going to happen from here. What you really need to be considering on is whether you think you want it to be legal to vote on the sports teams or not. That's what amendment number 2 is really all about. So, and again, it just applies to the professional sports, the Royals, the Chiefs, the Hockey League, the women's basketball, the NBA, which I don't even know if we've got all those teams or not, but that's what it's going to apply to. But you'll be able to do it online, and according to that paper also, where there's river boats and stuff like that, where it's allowed. Okay, next one is amendment number 3. That's the one I will tell you vote no on. Because remember back about 3 years ago, 3.5 years ago, whenever COVID hit, and everybody was doing everything, and the whole country, the whole world was basically shut down and scared because of COVID, and because people were dying from it. And I don't want to discredit that in any way, shape, or form, because nobody knew what to expect. And how upset everybody got because of all the deaths that were involved. And yet, we've been killing 600,000 to 800,000 unborn babies a year, and nobody seems to be concerned. And all this is going to do is just going to make it even more easily for someone no matter what stage of pregnancy, to end a pregnancy just simply because they don't want the child, or they just don't want to be a parent, or whatever it is. And so I strongly encourage you to vote no on amendment number 3. Next one. Amendment number 5 is basically an amendment that, if passed, will allow another riverboat in the Osage River down around the Bagnell Dam area to be put in place. And of course, the promotion on that is any money not used for whatever else they can come up with will go to early childhood development. Again, you know how that works. Amendment number 6. It's kind of a different amendment because at one time, court costs included, and Julie, please correct me if I'm wrong, court costs included fees that went to law enforcement to support them and also current and retired. And then it was decided that that was unconstitutional. This, as I understand it, would, if passed, would assess court costs to help pay for law enforcement, current and retired. Some will argue that this ought to be something that's done through the legislature. This bill would be assessing it to a court cost. Now, I can't find it in the bill. One of the deals that I did see on it said it would be adding like $3.50 onto each court case to be sent to that. And just me, you know, if you've got a need for law enforcement and the retirees and everything, why not charge the ones who are in court all the time anyway and let them pay for it? That's why we need them. But that's what this is all about. Amendment number 7. And it should be a no-brainer, but because of the world that we live in, it's not. Amendment number 7, if passed, will only allow legal residents of the state of Missouri and of the subdivision to vote in an election, and only one vote. Should be common sense, shouldn't it? In other words, someone from Nebraska cannot come over here and vote in our Princeton election if this is passed. Same as somebody who's from another country cannot come in and vote in our elections. So it just seems like common sense to me that a legal resident of the particular area, say like if you're from Princeton, that you'd get to vote in the Princeton elections, but no place else. And if you're in the state of Missouri, you get to vote for Missouri elections, but no other state. And if you're a citizen of the United States, then you get to vote in the United States. But this is only limited to Missouri. So that's what amendment number 7 is. Proposition A is the last one that is in that, and it is on Missouri minimum wage. If passed, it would establish a $13.75 per hour minimum wage starting in 2025, which starts next year. And then it would be increased by $1.25 the next year to where it would be $15 in 2026. And then it would also, after 2026, the minimum wage would be based on the price, on the consumer price index. And this would apply to any business that, as I read it, schools excluded, of course, it would apply to any business that does $500,000 worth of business in a year. Well, most farmers do more than that, you know. So it would also grant 1 hour of paid sick leave for every 30 hours that were worked. Start doing the math on that, and it does add up. My whole deal on this is I want you to know what's going on. I want you to be informed and not be like I have been so many times when I stepped into and pulled the little curtain and thought, what's this all about? And I can honestly say I have come home so many times after voting and then found out what I'd voted on, and only to realize that, I voted wrong. So that's what it's all about. How I'm tying this in. Turn to Luke chapter 14. In this passage of Scripture, Jesus has been going through doing what he did the best, and that was meeting people, healing people, changing their lives. And at this point, Jesus has already been in a religious ruler's house, and there was a man there with dropsy. If you just kind of go through this with me real quickly. And it was on the Sabbath, and Jesus turned to those religious rulers and he says, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? And they didn't want to self-incriminate themselves, so they didn't answer at all. And he heals the man, and then he says, now which one of you, if you had an ox or a son who fell into a well, wouldn't immediately go and get him out? So therefore, what has been done here is not a violation of the law. He then goes on and he says, now let me tell you a story. And he talks about if you're invited to a friend's house or somebody's house, a distinguished person's house, whenever you go to that house, he says, don't go to the place of honor and sit just as close to the front as you can, because the guy who is hosting it might come up and says, that seat's taken by somebody else. So, but there's a seat way down there you can sit in. And he says, you'll be humbled and disgraced while somebody else is honored. He says, but what you do, he says, whenever you go to that house, he says, you go way down there and sit, and then when the guest or the man of honor comes that is holding it, and he comes up to you and he says, please, come up and sit by me. In other words, humble yourselves and let God do the exalting, is what he's talking about. He's talking about different things here about as far as he has another story about a master who has a dinner. And he invites all these people to come, distinguished guests. And you know this story because you've heard it so many times probably in the past. And the first one says, well, he says, I'd like to come, but I just bought a piece of land and I must go look at it. Kind of indicating that, maybe it won't be there tomorrow. Or maybe it's just so important that I go look at it today. Another one says, well, I had just bought a pair of oxen and I can't come to your dinner because I got to go try them out. I got other things that are more important than this. And he talks to another one, and this is the one I've always loved. And he says, well, I've got a wife, and so I can't go. Just count me out. I can't go, because I've just taken a wife. I can't go. And when the servants come back to the master, and the master says, where's all my guests? And he says, well, they come up with one excuse after another. And he says, well, then go out into the highways and the byways and bring in the sick, the lame, the poor, the crippled, and bring them in. And they do that. And then he says, but I still have room. He says, go out into the highways and the hedges and the byways, and anyone you find, bring them in as well. And he says, if the ones who are invited don't come, then the ones who are willing to come are going to enjoy this feast. And the ones who were first invited are not going to have any part of it. Now then, this is where he ties it all together in the passage that I'm going to read. Starting with verse 25. Now a great multitude were going along with him, and he turned and said to them, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. Now, before I go on, I just want to clarify that he is not saying that we must hate everybody in our family. What he is saying, he says, if you are placing your love for someone else above your love for me, then you've got things out of order. Give you an example of what I mean. Person comes to Christ, and we've seen this time and time again. I have, I know, and I'm sure you have too. They come to Christ, they start going to church, and they start getting all excited, and they go home and they tell their wife, or they go home and tell their parents, or they go home and tell their brothers and sisters, and their brothers and sisters tee them and make fun of them and everything, and criticize them and are critical of them instead of rejoicing with them because they haven't made that decision. Now you have a choice. Do I stay with what has delivered me, what has set me free, what has really given my life purpose? Or do I cave to the pressures of my husband, my wife, my brothers, my sisters, my parents? Now then, here's the problem. If I cave to the pressures of those who are making fun of me, whether it's my friends or my family, then I'm telling my family and friends, the ones that I cave to, that what I experienced was really nothing at all. And there's no reason for you to ever even try it for yourself, because look how quickly I caved. But on the other hand, if you've experienced Christ and you go to your family or your friends and they try and make fun of you and try and discourage you and try to lead you astray from that, and you stand your ground and you hold your faith, you have a chance to witness to them of the greatness of God and what the power that God can have in your life if you'll just give him a chance. They saw this in the early church, and people were coming to the churches and accepting Christ, and it might be a husband that came but his wife didn't come, or a wife who came and her husband didn't come. And so then they come to Paul and they say, here I've accepted Christ and I want to follow in that, but my spouse is not a believer. So should I therefore divorce my spouse because they don't believe and share my beliefs? And Paul's response back to them was, he says, as long as you're willing to live together, then stay together, because it is through your witness that you will sanctify or save or witness to your spouse, that they might be a fellow brother or sister of Christ with you. That's why he said you must hate him. And it's not hate. If you're not willing to honor God above what everybody else thinks, then you're probably not going to make it work. Now he goes on, and he gives you, for instance, verse 28. For which of you, when he wants to build a tower, does not first sit down and calculate the cost to see if he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who observe it begin to ridicule, saying, this man began to build and was not able to finish. As I was thinking about that again this morning, I remembered back, of course, there's few people in here older than me, but not a lot. But I remember whenever you wanted to buy a car, when I turned 16, I didn't go to a dealership and borrow and finance to the dealership. I went to my banker. And my banker sat down and he says, well, how are you going to pay this back? And he wanted to know what my assets were, what my income was. It all made perfect sense. And he could tell me about what kind of money I could borrow, what I should be expecting to pay back, and how long it was going to take, and all the if, ands, or buts about it. And whenever I decided after the first year I wanted to trade for a different car, I went back to the banker, and we went through it all again. And we both knew what we was doing, because he knew all the money I owed, he knew everything about me, and he knew my repayment history. By the time I graduated from high school, I remember going to a car dealership and buying a car, filling out a little bit of paperwork from somebody who did not know me from a bank who was 100 miles or more away, and bought the car, financed it right there on the site. They didn't know it. That was back before we had, what's your credit score? And from that point on, when people quit having to go and answer the questions about whether you can afford this or not, look what happened to the price of cars, because you can finance it right there. Now then, we've got a law that has been passed where you can buy a car and finance the taxes on it through the dealership. Guess what's going to happen to the price of cars? Because you don't have to come up with $3,000 or $4,000 to pay taxes that you don't have. You just put it on payment. Put it on payment. The guy that he's talking about is decided to build a tower. Oh, a tower would be nice because I could sit up in my tower and I could look over all my fields and see what's going on. If any predators or anybody that was come to harm me, I could sit up in my tower and I could see them from a distance, and that would give me a chance to prepare for their arrival. If they were a friend, I could be there to welcome them. If they were a foe, I could be there to defend myself. Oh, if I just had a tower. And he says, but if you don't count the cost of the tower, what's it going to cost me to build that tower? You might not be able to finish it, and you get so far up, and everybody that walks by is going to say, looky there, there's half a tower. What a fool. Didn't have enough money to finish it. But the person who is so stuck on the tower itself and doesn't consider the cost is the one who might fall prey to that. I can't finish the tower. Oh, but a tower would be so nice. I think I'll do it anyway. Money will come from someplace, but it doesn't. And he says, consider the cost before you invest. Okay, let me go on. 31 through 35. Or what king, when he sets out to meet another king in battle, will not first sit down and take counsel whether he is strong enough with 10,000 men to encounter the one coming against him with 20,000? Or else, while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks terms of peace. So therefore, no one of you can be my disciple who does not give up all his possessions. Therefore, salt is good, but even salt has become tasteless. With what will it be seasoned? It is useless either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is thrown out. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Tells the first story about the guy who's thinking about building a tower. Then he tells us the second story about a king, and he has 10,000 men, and he's getting ready to come against a king who has 20,000 men. And he says, what if he doesn't consider what he's coming up against? What if he doesn't consider his strengths or his weaknesses? Then he may fall prey to that king who has more because he's not strong enough to defend himself. And whenever he comes to that conclusion, rather than to just go and fight for the sake of fighting and knowing he's going to lose, why not send a delegation and offer peace? It makes sense, doesn't it? Kind of like the guy who says, I've got enough money in the bank. I think with that and this, I think I can build that tower. And it'll be a great asset to my place. But not using wise counsel, you might say, I think a tower would look good on this place, so I'll just build it. We'll see how far it goes. And it falls flat. Or the king who says, he insulted me, I'm not going to put up with that, I'm going to go and fight him anyway, and then lose everything. Is Jesus really talking about investing money or going to war? Or is he talking about following Christ or not? Remember what he said at the beginning. Anyone who is not willing to put me in front of his mother, his brother, his wife, her husband, her brothers or sisters is not worthy. But we are to take up our cross. In other words, we are to sacrifice and deal with whatever we've been dealt and walk true with Christ. That is the point. Now then, I don't know about you, but I know before I accepted Christ, I went through a lot of soul searching and a whole lot of measuring as to whether, first of all, I had to figure out whether I could do it. You know, if I accept Christ, of course, my mistaken idea was that, I got to be perfect from here on out. And I was far from it, still am. And I thought, I'll never be able to make it. And so I put it off for a long time. And I continued to put it off as long as I had that feeling and that, I just can't be perfect. But whatever, it finally got to the point to where I realized that God was not asking me to be perfect, but to be submissive and to trust him. That even though I've made countless mistakes since that time, I have continued to follow him and continue to realize that following Christ is worth anything more than anything else I could have put in his place. And that's what he's really getting at. In other words, don't just go make a rash decision, but to weigh out your options, to see what the difference is. Now, I'm convinced, having been a Christian for several years, is that whenever you start weighing out your benefits versus your cost of being a Christian, Christ will win out every time. It's not to say you're not going to have some cost, but the benefits are going to be so much better and so worth so much more than to not. In other words, think long range. What happens so many times is people make a decision to accept Christ, and then it's kind of like the sower that sows the seed, and some of it lands among rocky soil, cares the world, and everything else starts choking out what you want to have in your life, and you sprout up, and then you just die because there's nothing there. But the seed that falls on good ground, where it can be nourished, where it can be watered, where it can have a chance to grow, it grows and produces 50 to 100-fold. What Christ is talking about there, and he's talking about to us today, is consider the long-range impact. Plan out. I was going through YouTube this morning real quickly, closing it down from last week and bringing it up for today. And I saw on last week's sermon where I preached on, no baptism, no church, don't be looking for loopholes. And, for those who just think, well, I don't have to go to church, to be a Christian. I don't have to be baptized to be a Christian, because the thief on the cross didn't. And it wasn't him. What I noticed was that I had one like and one dislike. And, immediately my ego goes, who didn't like that? Well, probably a lot of people didn't. But what struck me funny was at that time was that I thought, how ironic and how hypocritical for someone who says, I don't have to go to church to be a Christian, but then they're watching Christian sermons, church sermons, on YouTube. They don't need a church. Where's those sermons supposed to come from? What Jesus wants out of us is a committed relationship. And what he has promised over and over and delivered on over and over is the benefits of having a committed relationship with him. This, maybe I will, maybe I won't. Just never really materializes, and it never really rewards. When you do something on a whim, that's about how long it lasts. But whenever you commit to something, then it makes all the difference in the world. The other day, I'm going to tell a little bit on myself. Sherry says, Do you have a red pencil in your pocket you didn't take out and I washed it? It was one of those wax ones. We've got clothes that's got little red dots all over them now. She says, what's our stance on divorce again? She had 2 new pairs of jeans in there. And I said, well, if you remember, whenever we got married, we said we would not consider divorce until after the first 50 years, and we still got over 26 and a half left to go. So, in other words, for the next 26 and a half years, we're committed to work it out somehow. But a committed relationship produces results that work because it requires an investment. Now then, I started off this morning with all these propositions that you found in your paper, and if you're like I was 99% of the time, you just kind of looked at it and thought, forget that. I'm not interested in that. I'll see what public opinion is and go with that. What I want more than anything else is to give you just enough education that you can figure out where you stand on them. What you believe. What are not just look at the surface of it, but dig deep and see what's really going to happen if this passes or if this fails. That's what I'm really after, more than anything else. Because then I think that we can make, even if we don't agree, then we can make an informed decision. Because to make a whimsical decision on something like this could have some serious impacts on different people, for or against. The same with Christianity. If you make a whimsical decision about whether to accept Christ or not, and then later down the road you decide, it's just too much work. Look at all the people that you might deter from ever accepting what God has to offer just because we called it quits. Because we weren't committed. Because we failed. When Christ came to this earth, he knew exactly what his mission was. He knew what the implications were going to be. He knew what was going to be won and what was going to be lost. And that's why whenever it came time to go before Pilate, to go before the scourging, to go before the courts and be slapped and humiliated and crowned with thorns deep into his head when the blood was running down his body and from every part of his body, he already knew what the outcome was going to be because he was committed to that relationship. How many times do we read in there to where Jesus would go off by himself to pray, to talk to his Father, and make sure that he was doing everything right and that he had the strength to keep going in that direction? It is only because that he knew what he was doing ahead of time that we even have a church today that celebrates the resurrected life of Jesus Christ. What I ask today of myself and of each one of us is to carefully think out your life, your relationship with the world, but most importantly with Jesus Christ. And then think about the implications of what that can mean. I may not reach some of the people that I want to reach with my walk, but I'm going to try and stay true. Because in the meantime, I may reach somebody else that I had never even thought about. Never even considered. All for the glory of God. All for the glory of what Jesus Christ has done for each one of us. Let's not be flippant about our relationship with Christ or with our walk with Christ, but let us be committed, taking up our cross and following him. this morning as we've gathered here for worship. If the Lord has been speaking through His Holy Spirit to your heart about any decision that you need to make today, I pray that as the hymn of invitation is sung, that you will answer that call that He has placed upon your heart right now. As we stand to sing, Just a Closer Walk with Thee, number 561.